The muted melody from the church organ, a Miss Marple mystery. Hi there, welcome back to Haunting Vales. Tonight's mystery begins inside the village church, where the organ once filled the air with music every Sunday without fail. Then one morning, the melody faltered, a single note missing, replaced by an unsettling silence no one could explain. The villagers blamed age and neglect, but Miss Marple sensed something far more deliberate behind the broken harmony. As she listens closely, she notices patterns others ignore: the hymn chosen that day, the timing of the silence, and the way certain faces stiffened when the music stopped. It soon becomes clear that the organ was not merely out of tune, but altered to conceal a secret someone believed would remain unheard forever. Because sometimes, what is missing speaks louder than any sound. Before we uncover the truth behind the silenced melody, don't forget to subscribe for more haunting Miss Marple mysteries on Haunting Vales. Chapter 1: The Muted Melody from the Church Organ. The first thing anyone noticed was the silence. Not the peaceful kind that settles gently after a hymn, or the respectful hush that follows a prayer. This silence was wrong. It sat heavy in the stone body of St. Jude's Church, pressing against the ears like a held breath that refused to be released. Sunday morning sunlight spilled through the tall stained windows, painting the pews in soft colors, yet something essential was missing. The organ, proud and towering above the altar, did not sing. Villagers shifted in their seats. A cough echoed too loudly. A child whispered and was hushed at once. All eyes drifted upward, toward the pipes that had thundered and whispered for generations. The organ had never failed. Not during storms. Not during funerals. Not even during the war years, when candles had replaced electricity and fear had replaced faith. And yet, on this morning, when the organist pressed the keys, only a thin breath of air escaped, like a dying sigh. Miss Jane Marple noticed everything. She sat near the back, hands folded neatly in her lap, her knitting resting untouched beside her. She did not frown or gasp like the others. Instead, her pale eyes moved slowly from the organ loft to the faces below, reading expressions the way others read hymn books. Shock. Confusion. Annoyance. And beneath it all, a flicker of fear that no one wished to name. St. Jude's without music felt like a body without a heartbeat. The organist, Mr. Harold Finch, tried again. His fingers trembled as they pressed the keys with more force. The pedals moved beneath his feet. The bellows drew in air. And still, nothing but a weak, broken sound crept into the nave. A sound that did not belong to worship, but to warning. The vicar cleared his throat and stepped forward, offering gentle words about patience and prayer. The service continued, stripped of its music, each hymn reduced to murmured voices that struggled to find their pitch. Miss Marple listened closely, noting how voices that once blended now faltered. How confidence dissolved when structure was removed. She had seen the same thing in people many times before. After the final blessing, the congregation lingered longer than usual. Small knots of villagers formed between the pews and near the doors. Whispers fluttered like nervous birds. Miss Marple rose carefully, her joints protesting in their familiar way, and made her slow path down the aisle. She heard fragments as she passed. Never known it to fail. Something must be broken. Harold looked white as a sheet. Do you think someone touched it? That last whisper caught her attention. Outside, the churchyard hummed with uneasy conversation. Gravestones stood in neat rows, silent witnesses to centuries of secrets. Miss Marple paused near the old yew tree, pretending to adjust her shawl, while Mrs. Clara Denton spoke animatedly to anyone who would listen. Mrs. Denton had a talent for collecting information, though she often mistook noise for truth. They say the organ was fine yesterday, Mrs. Denton declared. Mr. Finch practiced in the evening. Heard it myself while walking my dog. Miss Marple turned slightly. Evening practice. Alone. She stored the detail away. Mr. Finch emerged at last, his face drawn, his hair more disordered than usual. He avoided the crowd at first, but Mrs. Denton intercepted him with the skill of a hunter. "Harold, dear, what happened?" she asked. "I don't know," he said, his voice thin. "Everything was in order. I checked the pipes, the bellows, the keys. It's as if the sound itself has been stolen." Stolen was an interesting word. Miss Marple approached gently, offering a kind smile. "Organs are very complex things," she said softly. "Much like people. Sometimes the smallest interference causes the greatest trouble." Mr. Finch looked at her then, truly looked, as if realizing she had been there all along. His eyes held more than confusion. They held fear. "I'm responsible," he said quietly. "If the organ cannot be repaired, the blame will fall on me." "And yet," Miss Marple replied, "blame is not always placed where it belongs." That afternoon, the news spread through the village like spilled ink. By tea-time, every household had its own version of events. Some claimed the organ pipes had collapsed. Others insisted damp had finally claimed the ancient wood. A few, lowering their voices, suggested deliberate interference. St. Jude's had been at the center of a disagreement for months, after all. The council's proposal to modernize the church had divided the village. New heating. New lighting. And, most controversial of all, a digital replacement for the old organ. Progress, they called it. Sacrilege, others whispered. Miss Marple had attended those meetings, quietly knitting while tempers flared. She remembered who had spoken most passionately, and who had remained silent. That evening, Miss Marple paid a visit to Mrs. Emily Hart, whose cottage overlooked the church grounds. Mrs. Hart prided herself on knowing everything that happened after dark. "I saw a light in the organ loft last night," Mrs. Hart said, pouring tea with shaking hands. "Late. Much later than Mr. Finch usually stays." "Did you see who it was?" Miss Marple asked. "No," Mrs. Hart admitted. "But it wasn't right. The light moved strangely. As if someone was searching for something." Searching. Another word to note. The next morning, the churchwarden unlocked St. Jude's for inspection. Miss Marple happened to be passing, her walk conveniently timed. She watched as the men climbed the narrow stairs to the loft. Voices echoed down, sharp with confusion. One of the organ pipes lay detached, carefully placed aside rather than fallen. Inside the mechanism, something had been wedged where it did not belong. Not broken. Not damaged. Silenced. This was done on purpose, the churchwarden said grimly. Miss Marple felt the familiar tightening behind her eyes. This was no accident, no random act of mischief. It was deliberate, thoughtful, and symbolic. Someone had wanted the organ muted, but not destroyed. A warning, perhaps. Or a message. As she left the church, Miss Marple glanced back at the towering instrument, now quiet and accusing. She thought of all the things people tried to silence. Guilt. Regret. Truth. And she suspected that before the organ sang again, something far darker would be forced into the open. The melody had been muted. But the mystery had only just begun. Chapter 2, A Silence Someone Needed. The silence inside St. Jude's did not fade with the passing of days. It deepened. Where once the church had breathed with sound, it now felt hollow, like a chest emptied of air. Each footstep echoed too sharply. Each whispered prayer seemed to cling to the stone walls instead of rising upward. Miss Marple sensed it the moment she crossed the threshold again, 2 mornings after the organ fell silent. Buildings, like people, reacted to disturbance. They remembered. She paused near the entrance, allowing her eyes to adjust to the dim light. Dust hung in the air, visible only where the sun cut narrow paths through the tall windows. The organ loomed above the altar, dark and watchful, its pipes rising like a frozen forest. It had been inspected, prodded, and declared tampered with, yet no one could say by whom or why. Mr. Finch sat alone in the front pew, shoulders slumped, his hands folded tightly together. He had aged several years in the space of a week. Miss Marple approached quietly and took the seat beside him. "You look as though you have not slept," she said gently. "I haven't," he replied. "Every sound wakes me. Every silence too." She nodded. Silence can be very loud when it carries unanswered questions. Mr. Finch hesitated, then leaned closer, lowering his voice. "They are watching me. I can feel it. As if everyone believes I did this myself." "Belief," Miss Marple said calmly, "often chooses the most convenient path, not the correct one." He swallowed hard. "I loved that organ. I still do. I would never harm it." "No," Miss Marple agreed. "But someone wanted others to think you might." That thought struck him like a physical blow. He stared ahead, eyes unfocused. "Why?" Miss Marple did not answer immediately. Instead, she stood and walked slowly toward the altar, her gaze drifting upward. The answer, she suspected, lay not in emotion but in motive. By midday, the churchyard was alive with speculation. The council had announced an emergency meeting to discuss the future of the organ. Repair costs were mentioned. Replacement was hinted at. Voices rose. Tempers sharpened. Miss Marple observed from the edge of the crowd, listening rather than speaking. Mr. Leonard Crowe argued loudly for modernization. "We cannot cling to the past forever," he declared. "This organ is old, unreliable, and now proven to be vulnerable." "And yet," replied Mrs. Agnes Bell, her voice trembling with anger, "it stood for over 100 years without incident. Until now." Miss Marple noticed the way Mr. Crowe's jaw tightened at that. A small thing, but telling. People often revealed themselves not by what they said, but by how they reacted when others spoke. That afternoon, Miss Marple visited the small maintenance room behind the church, where tools were stored and records kept. The door was unlocked. Inside, the air smelled of oil and old paper. She examined the logbook carefully. Mr. Finch's neat handwriting recorded every practice session, every minor adjustment. Nothing unusual. Until she reached the entry from the previous week. A note had been added in a different hand. Brief. Sharp. It read, "Inspection required. Access approved." Approved by whom, it did not say. Later, as dusk settled, Miss Marple walked the narrow lane behind the church. Mrs. Hart had been right. From this angle, the organ loft window was clearly visible. She stopped, pretending to admire the fading sky, and waited. After several minutes, a faint light flickered on inside the loft. Miss Marple's heart quickened, though her face remained calm. Someone was inside. She did not rush. Rushing frightened people, and frightened people made mistakes too quickly. Instead, she approached the side door, listening carefully as she climbed the stairs. The sound of movement reached her ears. Careful steps. A soft metallic clink. She cleared her throat deliberately. The movement stopped. A figure emerged from the shadows, stiff with surprise. It was Mr. Crowe. "You startled me," he said sharply. "I have council business here." "Of course," Miss Marple replied. "Late-night council business involving organ mechanisms." His eyes flicked past her, calculating. We are considering our options. So it seems, she said mildly. I wonder, Mr. Crow, why someone would wish to silence the organ without damaging it. He stiffened. I fail to see how that concerns you. Oh, it concerns me greatly, Miss Marple replied. Because it suggests intent. Not destruction, but persuasion. For a moment, his mask slipped. Just for a moment. Enough. The next morning brought darker news. Mr. Finch did not arrive to open the church. His cottage door stood ajar. Inside, the rooms were empty. No struggle. No note. Just absence. Panic spread quickly. Some whispered that guilt had driven him away. Others feared something worse. Miss Marple stood quietly in the cottage doorway, studying the untouched teacup on the table. People did not abandon tea when they planned to leave. She walked slowly back toward the church, her thoughts knitting themselves into a clear pattern. The muted organ. The planted blame. The late-night visits. And now, the missing man. Someone had silence more than music. And unless the truth was brought into the open, the next silence would be far more permanent. Chapter 3, When the Organ Found Its Voice. By the third day, the village had begun to fracture. Silence does that. It does not merely remove sound, it removes certainty. Without the organ's steady voice, routines collapsed. People arrived early to church and left quickly. Conversation stopped when others approached. Eyes lingered too long, searching for guilt in familiar faces. Miss Marple observed it all with quiet attention, aware that the truth often rose to the surface when people were most uncomfortable. Mr. Finch's disappearance weighed heavily over everyone. The police were involved now, though discreetly. A missing man in a small village could not be ignored, yet no one wished to believe the worst. Miss Marple stood at the edge of the churchyard as an officer spoke with the vicar, her sharp ears catching every measured word. No signs of struggle, the officer said. But the timing is troubling. Yes, Miss Marple murmured to herself. Troubling, but very useful. She returned to St. Jude's alone that afternoon. The church was unlocked, as it often was during daylight hours. Inside, the stillness felt thicker than before. She moved slowly toward the organ loft, her steps deliberate, her mind clear. She had spent a lifetime watching people behave when they thought no one was paying attention. And she had learned that truth rarely hid far from the place it was created. The loft bore signs of repeated visits. Not frantic, but careful. Someone had known exactly where to step, what to touch, what to leave untouched. Miss Marple examined the mechanism again, her eyes drawn to a small adjustment screw that had been loosened and retightened more than once. This had not been the work of a single visit. It had been rehearsed. Practice, she said softly. Just like a performance. That evening, she paid a call on Mr. Leonard Crow. His house was neat to the point of stiffness, every object arranged with deliberate care. He greeted her politely, though his smile did not reach his eyes. Miss Marple accepted tea and sat opposite him, her hands folded calmly in her lap. You have been very involved with church matters, she said pleasantly. I care deeply about the village, he replied. And the organ? It is outdated. Yet not destroyed, Miss Marple said. Only silenced. His fingers tightened around his cup. Miss Marple continued gently, you see, destroying it would have caused outrage. But muting it created doubt. Doubt about its reliability. Doubt about the man who played it. Mr. Crow leaned back. Are you accusing me of something, Miss Marple? I am merely observing, she replied. Observation is often enough. His voice hardened. The organist fled. That speaks for itself. On the contrary, Miss Marple said quietly. It speaks of fear. And fear usually comes from being cornered. For the first time, his composure cracked. Just slightly. Enough for her to see the truth beneath it. That night, Miss Marple did not sleep. Just before dawn, she wrapped her shawl around her shoulders and walked toward the church. The sky was pale, the air sharp. She waited in the shadows near the side door, her patience steady. When the light appeared again in the organ loft, she felt no surprise. Only confirmation. Mr. Crow entered quietly, tools in hand. Miss Marple followed. You need not continue, she said calmly, her voice echoing softly against the stone. He spun around, startled. You should not be here. No, she agreed. But you should not either. He straightened, anger flaring. This village needs to move forward. The organ stood in the way. Finch refused to cooperate. So you silenced the music, Miss Marple said, and tried to silence the man. His eyes widened. I never meant to hurt him. No, she said gently. You meant to frighten him. Enough that he would leave. Footsteps sounded on the stairs behind them. The police officer emerged, his expression grim. Mr. Finch followed. Alive. Pale. Determined. Mr. Finch spoke first. I hid. I was warned. Told the blame would fall on me if I spoke out. The officer stepped forward. We found the messages. And the tools. Mr. Crow's shoulders sagged. The performance was over. Later that morning, the village gathered inside St. Jude's. The organ had been restored. As Mr. Finch pressed the keys, the first notes rose slowly, carefully, then with growing confidence. The sound filled the church, warm and powerful. Some villagers wept openly. Others bowed their heads in relief. Miss Marple sat quietly at the back, knitting once more. The melody had returned, but more importantly, so had the truth. As the final chord faded, Miss Marple smiled to herself. Silence could hide many things, but it could never hide them forever. And somewhere deep within the church walls, St. Jude seemed to breathe again. If you enjoyed this Miss Marple mystery, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss another story where quiet villages hide dangerous secrets. Let us know in the comments what clue you noticed first, and which mystery you want next.